At 11:09 in the morning on June 4, 1944, and a sonar ping echoed through the warm Atlantic water about 150 nautical miles off the coast of Spanish Sahara. On the bridge of the American destroyer escort Chatillon, a young officer leaned over the contact display and felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. The pulse was sharp, metallic, and unmistakable. Somewhere beneath the surface, a German submarine was running silent, unaware that an American escort carrier task group had just stumbled across her track. What happened in the next 90 minutes would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. It would not be revealed to the German people for years. It would not be revealed to the families of the captured German sailors for almost 2 more years after that. And the documents pulled from that submarine, the codebooks, the cipher machines, the navigational charts, would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel the most carefully catalogued weapon system Nazi Germany ever built. The Kriegsmarine had spent 6 years sowing tens of thousands of sea mines across European waters. They had killed 534 Allied merchant ships, totaling more than 1.4 million gross registered tons. They had drowned thousands of Allied sailors. And they had been recorded, every single one of them, in a bureaucratic system so meticulous that when the Allies finally captured the master charts, the entire program collapsed inward on itself. This is the story of how German precision became German defeat. The weapon at the heart of this story was the naval mine. Germany entered the war in 1939 with the smallest of the major navies, but with one of the most sophisticated mine warfare programs in the world. The standard moored contact mine was the EMC, a spherical steel weapon just over a meter across, packing a 300-kilogram explosive charge, studded with 7 Hertz horns that detonated on contact with a ship's hull. Its design was overseen by the Sperrwaffen inspection at Kiel, the technical headquarters that had emerged in October 1936, when the Navy split its old combined torpedo and mine inspectorate into 2 separate commands. But the mine that struck terror into the Royal Navy was different. It was the magnetic ground mine, the LMA, and the larger LMB, dropped from German bombers on sea-green silk parachutes into shallow British coastal waters. These mines did not need to touch a ship. They sensed the steel hull's magnetic signature passing overhead and detonated on the seabed, breaking the keel from below. There were also acoustic mines, triggered by the sound of a ship's propellers, and combination mines that required both magnetic and acoustic stimulation before arming. Submarines carried the TMA moored mine and the TMB ground mine through their torpedo tubes. The heavier TMC, with a charge approaching 1 ton, could destroy any ship that passed within 36 meters of its position on the seabed. And then there was the weapon that haunted Allied planners through the spring of 1944, the pressure mine, the Druck mine, codenamed Oyster by the British. It responded to the hydrodynamic pressure drop beneath a moving ship's keel, a phenomenon no minesweeper could replicate from a safe distance. It could not be swept. It could not be defeated by the standoff sweeping methods that had taken the Royal Navy 4 years to develop. The only protection was speed reduction, slowing a vessel to the point where her hull no longer generated the pressure signature the mine was waiting for. By 1944, the Germans had thousands of these weapons in storage, waiting for the right moment. Behind these mines stood a national mine warfare program that had been built into the Kriegsmarine from the beginning. The Sperrwaffen inspection at Kiel was the technical brain of the operation, descended from the Imperial Navy's mine inspectorate of the First World War. Operational direction ran through 3 regional headquarters, one for the Baltic, one for the North Sea, and one for the West, headquartered first in Trouville on the French coast and later moved to Paris. Beneath these sat the M-boat flotillas, the R-boat flotillas, the Spurbreachers and the Vorpostenboots. More than 1,000 vessels at peak strength, carrying mines and laying them and tending the fields where they sat. The man whose name appears most consistently across this command structure was Friedrich Ruge, born in Leipzig in 1894. He served as a torpedo boat officer in the First World War, was interned at Scapa Flow when the German High Seas Fleet scuttled itself in 1919, and from 1921 onward specialized in mine warfare for the Reichsmarine. By June 1937, he commanded the Navy's minesweeping arm. In February 1941, he became Commander of Defences West, in charge of every mine, every sweeper, and every coastal patrol from the Spanish border to the Belgian coast. In November 1943, he was made naval advisor to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, charged with extending the mine barrier into the Atlantic Wall along the French coast. His name will return to this story. By 1944, the Kriegsmarine's mine program had become something more than a weapons system. It had become an archive. Every minefield was logged, plotted, code-named, and cross-referenced. Every individual mine, where possible, had a card in a master file called the Minenkarte, recording its barrier code, its chart sheet, its grid coordinate, its type, its serial number, the depth of laying, the charge weight, the fuse configuration, the date of laying, the vessel that laid it, the arming clock setting, and the ship counter setting that determined how many ships had to pass over before the mine became live. The barriers themselves carried operational code names: Wartburg, Apolda, Corbetha, Seigel, Nashorn, each one pointing to thousands of mines arranged in a defensive geometry across hundreds of square miles of seabed. The master atlas was called the Sperrkartenwerk, the bound work of barrier charts. Classified copies were held at the Naval Staff in Berlin, at the Sperrwaffeninspection in Kiel, and at every regional naval headquarters. The grid that organized them was called the Marine Quadratkarte, the naval square chart, developed in the mid-1930s and standardized for the Kriegsmarine by the eve of the war. It divided the entire globe on Mercator projection into two letter sectors of approximately 486 nautical miles per side. Each sector then subdivided into 81 smaller squares, then again and again, with letter modifiers carrying precision down to roughly a single nautical mile. Every mine position, every U-boat radio report, every convoy plot, every minefield in the Sperrkartenwerk used this grid. The British had broken significant portions of it before the end of 1939, but the Germans, lacking confirmation of that fact, retained the system, with only modest cipher overlays, until the very last day of the war. To picture the scale of the achievement, consider the Baltic. In the days before Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Kriegsmarine laid the Wartburg barrier between Memel and the Swedish island of Öland. Soon afterward, the Apolda and Corbetha barrages were laid across the mouth of the Gulf of Finland to seal in the Soviet Baltic fleet. From August 1941 onward, the Juminda barrage was laid further east by Kriegsmarine and Finnish mine layers, eventually totaling about 3,000 mines. During the Soviet evacuation of Tallinn on the night of August 28 to 29, 1941, Juminda destroyed roughly 21 warships and dozens of transports with thousands dead. By 1942, the Seigel and Nashorn complexes had locked the surviving Soviet fleet inside Kronstadt and Leningrad. Across the entire war, the Gulf of Finland received approximately 28,100 German mines, plus thousands of anti-sweeping devices, plus tens of thousands more from Finnish and Soviet hands, making it the most densely mined body of water on Earth. In 1944, the strategic situation was shifting. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned in 1943. Allied bombers were hammering German ports. Soviet armies were advancing in the east. American and British armies were assembling in southern England for the cross-channel invasion. And yet, by every measure that mattered to mine warfare, the German program was still functioning. New mines were being produced, new fields were being laid, the Sperrkartenwerk was being updated, and the card files in Kiel and Berlin were being kept current. The Allies knew the Germans had mined the English Channel. They did not know exactly where, or with what, or in what combinations. They were sweeping blind. But everyone could sense that the era of these mass minefield campaigns was approaching a strange kind of twilight. The naval war was no longer being fought between battle fleets in clear water. It was being fought in the approaches to invasion beaches, in the harbours of liberated French ports, in the choke points of the North Sea and the Baltic. Mines had once been a defensive weapon, a way for a smaller fleet to deny the approach to a coast. Now, they were becoming an obstacle to liberation itself. Every mine the Germans had laid was a problem that someone, someday, would have to solve, and every mine that was still recorded only in German files was a problem that no one outside the Kriegsmarine knew how to solve. The morning of June 4, 1944, began like any other day for the crew of the German submarine U-505. The boat had been at sea for 63 days. She had departed Brest on March 16 and had spent 2 months patrolling the African coast off French equatorial waters with little success. Her commander, Oberleutnant Zur See Harold Lang, was an experienced reserve officer who had taken over the boat in October 1943 after a string of personnel troubles. Morale aboard was thin. The boat had been depth-charged repeatedly. The crew was tired. Lang was running short on fuel and was preparing to turn the boat north toward home. At 11:09 in the morning, with the sun nearly overhead and the sea calm, the destroyer escort Chatelain registered her sonar contact. American Task Group 22.3, under Captain Daniel V. Gallery, aboard the escort carrier Guadalcanal, had been at sea since May 15, hunting U-boats in the eastern Atlantic. The same ships, then designated Task Group 21.12, had sunk U-515 and U-68 in April. Gallery had ordered every ship in his group to train a boarding party for the next encounter. He wanted to capture a U-boat, not just sink one. Every officer in the task group thought the idea was insane. Gallery insisted. Lieutenant Commander Dudley S. Knox, commanding Chatelain, attacked immediately with Hedgehog projectors and depth charges. Wildcat fighters from Composite Squadron VC-8 roared in over the contact and marked the boat's position with strafing fire. The depth charges detonated. Inside U-505, the lights went out. Water began pouring through ruptured fittings. The hydroplane controls jammed. Lang, wounded by gunfire as he climbed to the conning tower, ordered the boat blown to the surface and gave the order to scuttle. The crew opened the sea valves, set demolition charges, and abandoned ship. Only one German died in the action, signalman Gottfried Fischer, killed by strafing fire as he tried to man a topside gun. What followed was unprecedented in modern American naval history. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert Leroy David, of the destroyer escort Pillsbury, with torpedoman's mate 3rd Class Arthur Knispel and radioman 2nd Class Stanley W. Daviak, took a whaleboat across to the listing, circling possibly booby-trapped enemy submarine. They climbed onto her wet steel deck. They dropped through the open conning tower hatch into the dark, flooding interior. Inside, the boarding party located an open 8-inch sea strainer cover with seawater pouring in. Motor machinist's mate 1st Class, Zenon Lukosius, slammed it shut and stopped the flooding. The men then began gathering every document, every codebook, every chart they could find, throwing them into mailbags and passing them up through the hatch. A second salvage party arrived under Commander Earl Trocino, the Guadalcanal's chief engineer. Trocino made the inspired decision that saved the operation. He had Guadalcanal take U-505 under tow at speed, allowing the submarine's propellers to act as generators and slowly recharge her batteries enough to keep her pumps running. It was the first capture of an enemy warship at sea by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. The intelligence haul was extraordinary. A 4-rotor naval Enigma cipher machine with its current rotors and settings, codebooks, including the short signal book and the weather short signal book, the U-boat identification key book, hundreds of classified documents and operational charts, intact T5, Zaunkönig, acoustic homing torpedoes, the latest German anti-escort weapon, and, crucially for what would come later, the navigational charts the boat carried for her own safe passage through German minefields, along with grid plots of U-boat transit routes through the Bay of Biscay. Fleet Targabnaki took over the tow on June 7th. U-505, repainted and given the cover identity USS Nemo, arrived at Bermuda on June 19, 1944, after a tow of approximately 1,700 miles. The 58 surviving German crewmen were sequestered at Camp Ruston, Louisiana. They were denied international Red Cross visits and mail in deliberate violation of the 1929 Geneva Convention on direct authorization from Admiral Ernest J. King, because the risk of compromising the Ultra Signals intelligence operation overrode every other consideration. Their families in Germany were not informed they were alive until 1946. The men were not repatriated until December 1947. Admiral King's initial reaction to Gallery's coup was reportedly fury. He is said to have threatened a court-martial for the security risk before relenting and approving the Distinguished Service Medal. Lieutenant David received the Medal of Honor, the only one awarded to a naval officer in the Atlantic Fleet during the entire war. He did not live to receive it. He died of a heart attack in Norfolk on September 17, 1945, and the medal was presented to his widow Linda May David at the White House by President Harry Truman on October 5, 1945. But the larger consequence of the U-505 capture went far beyond the medals. The documents from the boat went directly to the cipher analysts at the United States Navy's Signals Intelligence Section in Washington and to their British counterparts at Bletchley Park. The grid charts and transit lane plots went to operational planners, and, crucially, the Germans did not know it had happened. The British and American security services maintained the cover that U-505 had been sunk with all hands. The cover held. The Kriegsmarine's Mine Warfare Command, the U-Boat Command, and the naval staff in Berlin continued to use compromised codes, compromised grids, and compromised charts for the next 11 months, all the way to the surrender. Every mine they laid after June 4, 1944, was potentially being recorded in two filing systems at once, the one in Kiel and the one in Washington. While that capture was unfolding in the South Atlantic, the largest seaborne invasion in history was being assembled in southern England. Operation Neptune, the naval phase of the invasion of Normandy, would put more than 7,000 vessels across the English Channel between June 6 and June 30, 1944. Every one of those vessels had to pass through what should have been the densest mine barrier in the world. By 1944, the Kriegsmarine had laid minefields along the entire English Channel, south of latitude 50 degrees north, with a clear corridor along the French coast, reserved for German use. The invasion force assembled in Area Z, nicknamed Piccadilly Circus, south of the Isle of Wight, then funneled south through what was called the Spout, into 10 parallel approach channels, swept through the German barrier, each 400 to 1,200 yards wide. The mine clearance operation was the largest in history. Approximately 350 minesweeping vessels were employed in total, including roughly 100 fleet minesweepers from the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the United States Navy, plus dozens of coastal sweepers, motor minesweepers, and danlayers. By 03:30 hours on June 6, all 10 channels had been swept and marked with Dan buoys. Not a single fleet minesweeper was lost on D-Day itself. Rear Admiral Alan G. Kirk, commanding the Western Task Force, wrote in his action report that the minesweeping had been the keystone in the arch of the entire operation, and that the performance of the minesweepers could only be described as magnificent. But the invasion succeeded for another reason that has been largely forgotten. The German Mine Warfare Command had failed. Admiral Theodor Kranke, the commander of Naval Group West, had not reinforced the Channel barrier in the weeks before the invasion. Hitler had personally held back the new pressure mines, fearing that any deployment would result in capture and analysis. Many existing German mines had self-sterilized, automatically deactivating themselves on the assumption that any Allied invasion would come earlier in the year. Friedrich Ruge, on Rommel's staff, recorded his frustration that the marine mines he had requested for the Atlantic Wall had never been delivered. The omission may have saved D-Day. The first warship lost in Operation Neptune was the American minesweeper USS Osprey, struck by a contact mine on the afternoon of June 5, 1944, while sweeping the approaches to Utah Beach. 6 men were killed. On D-Day itself, the British destroyer HMS Wrestler was so badly damaged by a mine off Juno Beach that she was declared a constructive total loss. On June 7, the troopship USS Susan B. Anthony struck a mine and sank, but in a feat that entered the records of maritime rescue, all 2,689 men aboard were saved. The same day, the minesweeper USS Tide had her back broken by a mine and split in two while under tow. On June 8, the destroyer escort USS Rich struck 3 mines in succession trying to assist the mine destroyer USS Glennon. Dozens of her men died. Then the Luftwaffe began sowing pressure mines, the Oysters, into the already swept Bay of the Seine on the night of June 6–7, 1944. They were unsweepable. The only countermeasure was speed reduction below the threshold at which a hull's pressure signature could trigger them. On June 24, 1944, the British troopship MV Derry Cunaghy, carrying men of the 43rd Reconnaissance Regiment off Sword Beach, was torn apart by an oyster mine. More than 200 men were killed in a single instant, the deadliest naval mining event of the entire Normandy campaign. The Allies had no answer. They needed a recovered intact specimen, and they would not get one for nearly another year. In the weeks and months that followed D-Day, the Allies began capturing the German mine warfare program port by port, headquarters by headquarters. Cherbourg fell on June 26 to 27, 1944, to Major General J. Lawton Collins's 7th Corps. The garrison's naval commander, Admiral Walter Hennecke, had ordered what an American engineer called the most complete and best prepared destruction in history. Hitler awarded him the Knight's Cross the day after his capture for it. But while harbour facilities had been demolished, a detachment of Britain's 30 Assault Unit, known as Wool Force, and commanded by Lieutenant Colonel A.R. Woolley of the Royal Marines, had landed on Utah Beach and pushed inland to seize the Kriegsmarine intelligence headquarters at the Villa Maurice in Octeville, just outside Cherbourg. They captured roughly 20 officers and several hundred enlisted men with the building's documents intact. Commander Quentin R. Walsh of the United States Coast Guard, attached to the American naval headquarters in Europe, accepted the surrender of the Cherbourg Naval Arsenal and won the Navy Cross for it. The barrier charts of the Western Channel approaches went straight into the hands of the coastal minesweeping flotillas opening the harbour. Cargo discharge into Cherbourg began in mid-July, and the port became a vital Allied logistics artery for the rest of the campaign. Brest held until September 19, 1944, against Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps, and cost roughly 10,000 American casualties. When Brigadier General Charles Canham arrived to accept General Hermann Bernhard Ramke's surrender, the German demanded to see Canham's credentials. Canham gestured at the American soldiers around him and said, "These are my credentials." The line became the motto of the United States 8th Infantry Division. Brest's port facilities had been so thoroughly destroyed that not a single Allied troopship docked there before Paris fell. But the harbour commander's files and harbour mine plans were captured intact. After Brest, Eisenhower ordered the remaining Atlantic fortresses merely contained rather than assaulted. Lorient surrendered on May 10, 1945, Saint-Nazaire on May 11, La Rochelle and La Pallice on May 8. The U-boat bunker at La Pallice was captured intact. With each of these surrenders came the local barrier charts of the Bay of Biscay U-boat transit lanes, sometimes preserved deliberately by German officers who understood that post-war coastal traffic could not survive without those charts. The most strategically important port capture of the autumn of 1944 was Antwerp. The city was taken on September 4 by the British 11th Armoured Division, with Belgium's underground White Brigade preventing port demolition. But the 80-kilometre Scheldt estuary, the only deep-water approach to the port, remained in German hands until November. The clearance of the Scheldt, called Operation Calendar, ran through early to late November 1944 under Captain H. G. Hopper of the Royal Navy. Over 100 minesweepers in 10 flotillas from the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Netherlands Navy operated under fire from German guns at Knokke and Flushing. They swept exactly 267 mines, and on November 28, 1944, the first Allied convoy entered Antwerp, led by the Canadian-built freighter Fort Cataraqui. By December, the port was discharging more than 22,000 tons of supplies a day, more than 3 times the rate the Mulberry artificial harbours had achieved off Normandy. Eisenhower had warned Montgomery in autumn 1944 that of all Allied operations on the entire Western Front, Antwerp was of first importance. Without the Scheldt sweep, the war's final winter would have been longer, colder, and far more costly. In April and May 1945, the chain of captures reached the heart of the Reich itself. Bremen fell on April 26. Bremerhaven was occupied in early May. Hamburg surrendered on May 3 to the British 7th Armoured Division, with the Blome and Voss Yard, the lead Type 21 submarine construction facility in Germany, intact. Kiel followed days later. And with Kiel came the prize itself, the Minen inspection, the central technical headquarters of German mine warfare, the Sperrwaffenversuchskommando, the experimental command, the mine prototypes, the late war pressure mine stocks. 30 assault units Colonel Humphrey Quill personally drove to Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters at Plön to obtain a written order that nothing be withheld from his unit, and Professor Helmuth Walter then cooperated, demonstrating his hydrogen peroxide submarine designs, his torpedoes, and his weaponry. The largest single capture of Kriegsmarine personnel and material came at Wilhelmshaven on May 6, 1945. General Stanisław Maczek's 1st Polish Armoured Division, attached to the 1st Canadian Army, accepted the surrender. The actual ceremony was conducted by Maczek's deputy, Colonel Antoni Grudzinski, of the 10th Armoured Cavalry Brigade. Approximately 32,000 soldiers and 1,900 officers, including a general and 2 admirals, passed into Polish custody, along with around 200 Kriegsmarine vessels of all classes. With them came the records of the Naval High Command North Sea and the local barrier charts for the German Bight. The Polish division administered a 6,500 square kilometre occupation zone around Wilhelmshaven for 3 years, and the German town of Harren was renamed Maczków in honour of the division. The political end of the Kriegsmarine came at the Naval Academy at Mürwik in Flensburg, where Admiral Karl Dönitz had set up his short-lived Reich government on May 2 and 3, 1945. From Mürwik, on May 4, General Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg, Dönitz's successor as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, signed the partial surrender to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery on Lüneburg Heath. From Mürwik, on May 7, Colonel General Alfred Jodl was sent to Reims for the unconditional surrender. And from Mürwik, on the morning of May 23, 1945, the Flensburg government was finally dissolved in Operation Blackout. British troops from the King's Shropshire Light Infantry and a Royal Air Force Regiment task force descended on the academy. Dönitz, Jodl and Friedeburg were summoned aboard the liner Patria and informed of arrest. Friedeburg committed suicide by cyanide rather than face strip search. Hundreds of officers and government members were taken into custody. Dönitz, Jodl and Albert Speer were flown that day to Camp Ashcan at Mondorf-les-Bains in Luxembourg. 6 days before Operation Blackout, on May 17, 1945, a separate Allied unit had achieved a parallel intelligence coup on the same campus. The Target Intelligence Committee Team 6, the Anglo-American Naval Signals Intelligence Team under Commander A.M.S. Mackenzie of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, located at the Naval Signal School at Flensburg-Mürwik, essentially the entire archive and personnel of the German Naval Signals Intelligence Service, the B-Dienst. Among those interrogated on May 24 and 25, 1945, was Senior Government Councillor Wilhelm Tranow, the head of the B-Dienst's English language section, who had broken British Naval Cipher No. 3, the convoy code, in late 1941. The historian David Kahn would later write in his book, Seizing the Enigma, that if one man in German intelligence ever held the keys to victory in World War II, it was Wilhelm Tranow. The single largest seizure of German naval records of the entire war happened in late April and early May, 1945, at a Bavarian estate called Schloss Tambach, near Coburg, in northern Bavaria. The Naval Archive had been moved to Tambach in November 1943, in advance of the heaviest air raids on the Tirpitzufer building in Berlin. Roughly 300 tons of paper sat in the cellars and outbuildings of the estate, containing the complete operational logs, war diaries, technical reports, and administrative minutes of all German naval business going back to 1870. The Imperial Navy and the Kriegsmarine, in their entirety, recorded across 75 years of paperwork. Its custodian was Vice Admiral Walter Gladish, a First World War veteran in charge of the Kriegsmarine Historical Service. The 30 Assault Unit detachment that reached Tambach was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Trevor Glanville of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. Accounts from the unit describe a striking scene at the Schloss. A pyre had been prepared in the grounds, ready to consume the entire archive should the Soviet army arrive first. Either Gladish's nerve failed at the last moment, or the local villagers had quietly stolen the gasoline meant to start the blaze. Either way, the pyre was never lit. Gladish had in fact been ordered by Dönitz to surrender the archive to the Western Allies. It was a deliberate, strategic decision, of a piece with Dönitz's parallel decision to preserve the minesweeping infrastructure rather than destroy it. Commander Ian Fleming, the Royal Navy intelligence officer who would later write the James Bond novels, flew out personally at the war's end to oversee the document extraction. Gladish was taken with the archive and worked for some months at the Admiralty editing the captured material. Among those papers were the master volumes of the Sperrkartenwerk, the technical reports of the Sperrwaffen inspection, and the war diaries of every coastal defence and mine-laying flotilla in the Kriegsmarine. Documents from Tambach were used at the Nuremberg trials as evidence against Admirals Erich Raeder and Karl Dönitz. Today, most of the trove sits on microfilm at the United States National Archives. These three captures, U-505 in June 1944, the chain of port seizures from Cherbourg to Wilhelmshaven through 1944 to 1945, and Tambach plus Mürwik in late spring 1945, produced an Allied intelligence picture of German mine warfare more complete than the Kriegsmarine's own files at any single moment of the war. Around them worked the United States Naval Technical Mission in Europe under Commodore Henry Adrian Shard, established by directive on December 26, 1944, and operating until November 1, 1945. The mission fielded hundreds of officers, civilian technicians, and enlisted men, swept up thousands of documents and crates of equipment, and shipped them back to American naval laboratories for exploitation. The companion British operation was 30 Assault Unit itself, Ian Fleming's commando, created from the Trout Memo of March 1942 and modelled on the German Abwehr Commando units. Its motto was, "Attain by surprise." Its role was to land with the assault troops, seize naval intelligence, and exploit it. From the Dieppe raid to Algiers to Sicily, then to Cherbourg, Paris, Walcheren, Bremen, Hamburg, Kiel, and finally Tambach, 30 Assault Unit produced one of the most consistent intelligence exploitation records of the entire war. There remained one thing the Allies still had not, could not, defeat: the pressure mine. Hitler had withheld it from deployment for fear of capture and reverse engineering. Dönitz, succeeding Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy in January 1943, had held it back further until D-Day. Even after deployment off Normandy, no intact specimen had been recovered for analysis. The countermeasure remained speed reduction, and that was all. The man who finally cracked it was an Australian. Lieutenant George Gosse, of the Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve, attached to Naval Party 1571, the so-called P parties of port clearance divers, trained at the Royal Navy Mine Warfare Establishment at Brixham. Gosse was working at the Überseehafen in Bremen on May 8, 1945, the day the war in Europe ended. His divers located the first intact German pressure mine ever recovered. On May 9, 1945, working blind in muddy water and entirely by touch, Gosse extracted the primer from a tube some 18 inches inside the mine, interrupting the detonation train. As he ascended, he heard a metallic crash beneath him. Examination on shore showed that the detonator had fired at the very instant the primer was removed. Only the absence of the primer had prevented the main charge from going off. He defused 2 more oyster mines at Bremen in the days that followed. In both, the detonator again fired before the mine reached the surface. He was awarded the George Cross. Without him, said one of his colleagues, Bremen harbour would have been unusable. The Kriegsmarine was not invulnerable to its own work, and the captured archives revealed how often German minefields had killed German ships. The most spectacular self-inflicted disaster came on the night of December 11 to 12, 1944, in the Gulf of Finland. The 6th Destroyer Flotilla, including the modern destroyers Z-35, Z-36, and Z-43, plus the large torpedo boats T-23 and T-28, was sailing to lay a new minefield near the Estonian coast. In bad weather, navigation error carried them about 2.5 miles north of the planned line. They sailed straight into their own existing Nashorn minefield. Z-35 and Z-36 detonated mines and went down with virtually all hands. No rescue could be attempted because of the surrounding mines. Earlier, on August 18, 1944, 3 Elbing-class fleet torpedo boats, T-22, T-30, and T-32, had been lost in Narva Bay, running into a German field. The auxiliary cruiser, escort, and Spurbrecher community absorbed similar losses across the war. Roughly half of the more than 100 vessels converted to Spurbrecher service were lost, many to Allied mines, but some to plotting errors in their own fields. There is one earlier German loss that belongs to this same category, with an additional twist. On the night of February 22, 1940, the destroyers Z-1 Leberecht-Maas and Z-3 Max Schulz were transiting a swept channel through the German Westwall barrage in the North Sea. A Heinkel 111 of Bomber Wing 26 attacked them by mistake, hitting Z-1. The damaged destroyer drifted out of the swept lane and into a British minefield laid weeks earlier by Royal Navy destroyers. The mines sank her. Z-3, attempting rescue, struck the same British minefield and broke up. Hundreds of German sailors died. The story usually gets told as a friendly fire tragedy, but the killing weapon was an Allied minefield that the Germans had not charted because they did not know it existed. It was, in its own way, a foretaste of what would happen to the Kriegsmarine when its own records were taken from it. When the war ended, the Royal Navy faced a problem of arithmetic. Roughly 600,000 mines had been laid by all sides in northwestern European waters. Britain and the United States had drawn down their wartime mine-sweeping fleets. Sweeping that scale of weaponry would take decades of British, American, Canadian, Norwegian, and Dutch lives. The solution was to keep the Kriegsmarine's mine-sweeping infrastructure in service. On June 21, 1945, under the authority of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the German Mine-Sweeping Administration was authorized. Vice Admiral Sir Harold Burrow, the British naval commander-in-chief Germany, appointed Rear Admiral Fritz Krauss as chief of the German Minesweeping Command. Krauss had directed Kriegsmarine minesweeping during the war. The British Commodore directing the operation on the Allied side was Commodore H.T. England of the Royal Navy. The administration's headquarters were at Glucksburg, then Gluckstadt on the Elbe, and later at Hamburg. Personnel, initially around 44,600, in May 1945, stabilized at roughly 27,000 men. In autumn 1945, they operated about 300 former Kriegsmarine vessels. They were classified as surrendered enemy personnel rather than prisoners of war, a deliberate semantic device to circumvent the 1929 Geneva Convention's prohibition on dangerous prisoner labor. They were paid, allowed limited leave, but compelled to serve. In May 1946, they were reuniformed in plain blue work dress with sleeve rank. Their flag was the Doppelstander C, a pair of Flag C pennants. Some captains flew the international yellow Q flag, known in service slang as Quatsch, meaning nonsense, as a quiet protest. The light cruiser Leipzig, one of the few major Kriegsmarine surface ships to survive the war, briefly served as accommodation hulk at Wilhelmshaven for the men of the administration. The decisive operational input was the captured Spur Kartenwerk and the Minenkarte card files. Throughout the war, Allied minesweepers had been forced to traverse each so-called swept channel up to 15 times to clear delay armed mines. With German records in hand, the German minesweeping crews could go directly to mine positions, confirm field boundaries, and avoid wasting effort on areas that had already been cleared but not properly recorded by Allied chart keepers. The cost in lives was real. Per the authoritative post-war study by Wolfgang Tham, 348 personnel were killed in the line of duty between 1945 and 1948, and 10 vessels were lost. But the scale of clearance was unprecedented. Across the entire post-war effort, an estimated 9 in 10 of the mines laid in Western European waters were neutralized within 5 years. The administration was disbanded in January 1948, principally under Soviet pressure. The Soviet Union feared, correctly, that the organization was a covert nucleus for a future German Navy. The British Admiralty, remembering how the post-First World War German Navy had used minesweeping work to preserve a cadre of officers and skills, also wanted to wind it up. Its civilian successor under British customs control lasted until 1951, after which personnel migrated into the West German Border Guard at sea and the United States Navy's Labor Service Unit at Bremerhaven, which lasted until 1957. These bodies, together with covert Baltic patrol units and the Naval Historical Team at Bremerhaven that employed Friedrich Ruge from 1949, became the institutional incubators of the West German Federal Navy that emerged in 1956. Ruge himself became the first inspector of the Navy, of the Federal Navy, on June 1, 1957, and held the post until 1961, completing the institutional arc that had begun with his apprenticeship in mine warfare in the German Navy of the 1920s. The intelligence value of the captured charts went well beyond accelerated sweeping. When the Allied Technical Missions and the German Minesweeping Administration cross-checked Allied wartime intelligence against captured German records, the discrepancies were striking. Allied estimates of German mining in Norwegian waters proved substantially low. Post-war clearance revealed tens of thousands of German mines along the Norwegian coast and in the Skagerrak anti-submarine barrage. The Gulf of Finland turned out to contain over 60,000 mines from German, Finnish, and Soviet hands, a layered hazard whose full extent had been guessed but never measured. In the Baltic, the post-war discovery was that the Soviets and Germans had repeatedly relayed the same field since 1941. Mines were the second most productive German anti-shipping weapon of the war, far behind U-boats by tonnage but far cheaper per hull sunk, and disproportionately effective in choke points, where they could close ports and channels for days at a time without hitting anything at all. The work that began under Burrow and Krauss is not finished. The German Federal Environment Ministry estimates that roughly 1.6 million tons of unexploded conventional ordnance remain in the German North and Baltic Seas combined. That figure includes both wartime fields and the post-war dumping grounds where surrendered German stocks were sunk between 1945 and 1948. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization's annual open spirit clearance operations in the Baltic, run since the 1990s, regularly find more than 100 mines in a single deployment. The work has new urgency because of offshore wind power. European wind farm construction in the North Sea and the Baltic has run repeatedly into German wartime ordnance, and unexploded mines have been detonated under controlled conditions during recent foundation surveys. Germany launched a €100 million systematic seabed clearance program in the summer of 2024, with a pilot project completed in autumn 2025 in the Bay of Lübeck. The German Navy's modern descendants of Ruge's force, the Mine Clearance Diver Company at Eckernförde, the Frankenthal-class minehunters of the 3rd Minesweeper Squadron at Kiel, and the Seehund-class drone sweepers that simulate ship signatures to trigger bottom mines, clear ordnance every spring and summer along the German coast. The memorials of this story scatter across 3 continents. The Naval Memorial at Le Beau on the Baltic coast, with the preserved Type 7 seaboat U-995 on the beach, was rededicated in 1954 to all sailors of all nations. The German Naval Museum at Wilhelmshaven preserves the destroyer Mölders and the minesweeper Weilheim. The Minesweepers Memorial at Cuxhaven acknowledges the post-war German clearance period directly. And U-505, captured by Captain Daniel Gallery's task group on June 4, 1944, sits in her purpose-built underground hall at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. She was dedicated on September 25, 1954, designated a National Historic Landmark in 1989, and Albert David's Medal of Honor is displayed beside her hull. She is the most direct surviving witness to the moment when the Allied intelligence campaign against the German mine warfare system began to break open. There is a particular kind of historical irony in this story that does not appear in the more familiar narratives of the Second World War. The German mine warfare program was not defeated by a better mine. It was not defeated by a better minesweeper. It was not defeated by overwhelming numbers, or by a single brilliant tactical stroke, or by the kind of decisive battle that commanders dream of. It was defeated by its own paperwork. The Kriegsmarine had built a weapon system that depended on records, on charts, on card files, on the bureaucratic memory of an entire institution. When that institution lost its records, the weapon lost its meaning. The deepest irony of the story is the figure of Karl Dönitz himself. As Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, Dönitz had held back the pressure mine specifically to deny it to Allied capture. He had calculated that the value of surprise outweighed the value of immediate deployment. And yet, in the same months that he was hoarding the pressure mine, he was also ordering Admiral Gladish to preserve the Tambach archive rather than destroy it. He understood, by the spring of 1945, that German civilians and German merchant traffic could not survive the post-war without Allied minesweeping help. The same hand that had withheld the oyster opened the chart cabinet. From June 1945 onward, surrendered German sailors swept their own minefields under Royal Navy command, working from their own charts, and the institution that had cost so many Allied lives became, within 3 years, the instrument of its own erasure. The men who served in that post-war minesweeping force were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were defeated soldiers performing dangerous work because they had no other choice. 348 of them died doing it. Their names appear on the memorial at Cuxhaven, alongside the names of the Allied minesweeper crews who died doing the same work during the war. The mines did not care who had laid them. They only cared whether you had the chart that told you where they were. The lesson of this story is not about the technical superiority of any particular weapon. It is about the fragility of secrecy in a war fought across entire continents and oceans. A weapon system can be only as secure as its records. A minefield is only as effective as the chart that maps it. When the Germans lost their charts, they did not just lose information. They lost the entire architecture of denial that the mine warfare program had been built to create. The British, the Americans, the Canadians, the Norwegians, and the Dutch could now sail safely through waters that had been death traps weeks before. The Soviets, denied access to most of the captured Western archives, would spend decades clearing the Eastern Baltic without German chart support, and the work in those waters remains incomplete to this day. Captain Daniel Gallery did not know, on June 4, 1944, that the documents pulled from U-505 would become part of a chain of captures that would unravel an entire weapons program. He thought he had captured a U-boat. Lieutenant Albert David did not know, when he climbed down through the conning tower hatch of a sinking enemy submarine, that the papers he was throwing into a mailbag would help save thousands of post-war civilian lives in the harbours of Bremen, Hamburg, Antwerp, and Oslo. He thought he was saving his ship from being booby-trapped. The British commandos who broke down the doors at Octeville and the cellars of Schloss Tambach saw themselves as soldiers grabbing whatever paperwork looked classified. None of them saw the larger pattern. But in the aggregate, across 11 months and 3,000 miles of European coastline, those individual acts of capture became something larger than any of them. They became the dismantling of a weapon system from the inside out. Friedrich Ruge, who had spent his career building German mine warfare doctrine, ended his career as the first commander of the post-war German Federal Navy, an institution that existed only because the program he had built had been comprehensively defeated. What remains is the principle. A weapon catalogued is a weapon that will eventually be removed. The Germans, in their administrative thoroughness, had written their own clearance manual. They had recorded every mine with such precision that, when the right people obtained the records, the destruction of the weapon system became merely a matter of time and labor. They had made themselves vulnerable through the very efficiency that had made them dangerous. It is not a story of battle, it is a story of paperwork. It is the story of how the most carefully recorded weapons program of the Second World War was undone by the records that defined it. The mines, in the end, belonged to whoever held the chart.